Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. I've read a lot of stories here. Stories of betrayal, of loss, of human cruelty. I never thought I'd be the one telling my own. But some things are too heavy to carry alone, and the anonymity of the screen feels like the only confessional booth I can stomach. My story isn't about a ghost or a monster in the traditional sense, but the monsters in it were real, and they wore the faces of the people I loved most. It started, as so many horrors do, on a perfectly beautiful day. The kind of late summer day that feels like a warm, golden promise. The air in the Ardennes forest was crisp, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a perfume I used to associate with freedom and peace. Now it's the smell of a tomb I crawled out of. We were on our annual camping trip, a tradition that had started when Clara and I were first dating. This year was special, or so I thought. Our son Leo was 8, old enough to truly appreciate the wild, to learn the names of trees and the tracks of animals. And our best friends, Marcus and Sophie, were with us, as they always were. Marcus and I had been like brothers since university, a bond I thought was forged in something stronger than steel. We'd seen each other through failed exams, terrible breakups, career changes, and eventually, we were best men at each other's weddings. He was Uncle Marcus to Leo, the fun uncle who always brought the best gifts and had the wildest stories. Clara and Sophie were just as close, a friendship that seemed to exist in a language of its own, full of knowing glances and shared histories. The four of us and Leo, we were a unit, a family in all but blood. The first day was idyllic, almost painfully so in retrospect. We set up our tents in a familiar clearing, a spot we'd claimed as our own over the years, nestled by a talkative little stream. We grilled sausages over an open fire, the smoke curling up into the twilight sky. Leo, his face smeared with ketchup and joy, chased fireflies with a jar, while the four of us adults sat back, sharing a bottle of wine and laughing about old times. I remember watching Clara, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. She seemed serene. For months, she'd been distant, stressed. I'd put it down to her high-pressure job at the marketing firm, long hours, demanding clients. I tried to talk to her about it, to offer support, but she would just smile a tight, weary smile and say she was fine, just tired. That night by the fire, she looked like the woman I'd fallen in love with a decade ago. She leaned her head on my shoulder, her hand finding mine. It felt like a homecoming. I squeezed her hand, a silent reassurance that we were okay, that whatever storm she was weathering at work, we would weather it together. Marcus was in top form, telling a hilarious, slightly exaggerated story about a disastrous fishing trip. Sophie was laughing so hard she was wiping tears from her eyes. Leo, having given up on the fireflies, came and curled up in my lap, his breathing slowly evening out as he drifted to sleep. I remember thinking, right in that moment, that this was it. This was everything. The perfect, simple, unassailable happiness of a life well lived with people you love. If I could have bottled that feeling, I'd have traded my soul for it. The next morning, the sun streamed through the canvas of our tent, waking me with its gentle warmth. Leo was still fast asleep, his small hand clutching a pine cone he'd found the day before. I slipped out of the tent, the morning dew cool on my bare feet. The campsite was quiet. Marcus and Sophie's tent was still zipped tight. I started a small fire, putting a kettle of water on for coffee, breathing in the clean air. It was a perfect morning for a short hike, a little father-son adventure. When Leo finally stirred, I had the idea. We'd go to Eagles Point, a small outcrop about a 45-minute walk away that had a decent view of the valley. We could be back before the others were even done with breakfast. Clara was just emerging from our tent, stretching like a cat in the sunlight. I told her our plan. She smiled, a soft, genuine-looking smile. She kissed my cheek, then bent down to kiss Leo's forehead. "Have fun, my two brave explorers," she said. "Don't get eaten by bears." We all laughed. Leo puffed out his chest and declared he would fight any bears with his trusty stick. Marcus poked his head out of his tent, sleepy-eyed, and gave us a lazy wave. "Bring back some treasure," he mumbled, before disappearing back inside. And so we went. The walk was wonderful. I pointed out different types of ferns to Leo, showed him how to identify a woodpecker's drumming, how the lichen on the trees always grew a little thicker on the northern side. He was a sponge, soaking it all in, his bright, curious eyes missing nothing. We held hands, and he chattered away about school, about his friends, about the video game he was trying to beat. It was one of those pure, uncomplicated moments of fatherhood that you know you'll remember on your deathbed. We reached Eagles Point and sat on the sun-warmed rocks, sharing a granola bar I'd stuffed in my pocket. The view was spectacular, a rolling tapestry of green and gold under a vast, cloudless sky. We didn't stay long, maybe 20 minutes, just enough to catch our breath and soak in the beauty of it all. The walk back felt quicker, our steps light with the promise of pancakes and coffee. We were still a few hundred yards from the clearing when I noticed the silence. There was no sound of laughter, no clatter of pans, no smell of coffee or frying bacon. Just the whisper of the wind through the pines and the chirping of birds. A small, cold knot began to form in my stomach. "They must be playing a trick on us," Leo said, his voice small. "Hiding." I forced a smile. "Maybe, let's go find them. We'll sneak up on them." But as we stepped into the clearing, the cold knot in my stomach turned into a block of ice. It wasn't just quiet, it was empty. Gone. The tents were gone. The large, family-sized tent we shared with Leo and the smaller dome tent Marcus and Sophie used, gone. The campfire was a cold, gray circle of ash. The cooler box full of our food, gone. The camp chairs, the portable stove, the lanterns, gone. Our cars, parked at the edge of the clearing, my reliable old Volvo and Marcus's flashy SUV, were gone. It was as if we had never been there, as if the last 24 hours of laughter and warmth had been a collective hallucination. My mind refused to process it. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Clara!" I shouted, my voice sounding thin and strange in the empty air. "Marcus! Sophie! This isn't funny!" Silence. Only the echo of my own desperate voice came back to me. Leo's hand tightened in mine, his knuckles white. "Daddy, where did they go?" he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. I didn't have an answer. I started to search, frantically, my brain cycling through 1,000 impossible explanations. A flash flood? No, the stream was calm, the ground was dry. A park ranger telling them to move? They would have waited for us. A medical emergency? They would have left a sign, something, anything. I ran to the spot where our tent had been, the grass flattened in a perfect rectangle, a ghost of our presence. I checked Marcus's spot. Nothing. I circled the entire clearing, my calls growing more frantic, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Panic, cold and sharp, was beginning to claw its way up my throat. And then I saw it. On the rough-hewn wooden picnic table that was the clearing's only permanent feature, there was a single, small white square. A piece of paper, folded in half, held down by a smooth gray stone. My legs felt like lead as I walked towards it. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely pick it up. I unfolded it. The handwriting was Clara's. Neat, controlled, the familiar loops and swirls I'd seen on 1,000 birthday cards and shopping lists. The message was only 6 words long. 6 words that detonated my world, that ripped the foundation of my life out from under me. 6 words that I will see etched on the back of my eyelids for the rest of my days. This is for the best. Trust me. That was it. No explanation, no apology, no I love you, no goodbye. Just that. A cold, clinical, devastatingly cruel statement. I read it again and again, the words blurring through the sudden tears that filled my eyes. Trust me. The irony was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I looked around at the empty clearing, at the silent, indifferent trees, at my small, terrified son, whose world had just been shattered alongside mine. He was looking at me, his face pale, waiting for an explanation I couldn't give, waiting for a reassurance I didn't have. In that moment, the truth settled in, heavy and suffocating as a shroud. This was no accident. This was no emergency. This was deliberate. My wife, the mother of my child, and my best friends, the people who were our chosen family, had packed up their lives, packed up our shared existence, and left us here. They had left us in the middle of a vast, unforgiving wilderness with nothing but the clothes on our backs and a cryptic, insane note. They hadn't just left us, they had left us to die. The silence of the forest was no longer peaceful, it was predatory. And as I stood there holding that piece of paper with my son's trembling hand in mine, I understood that the monsters were not in the woods. I had been sleeping next to one for 10 years. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it was a concept my mind struggled to grasp. It was one thing to leave, to have an affair, to end a marriage. People do that. It's painful, but it's human. This, however, was something else entirely. This was inhuman. It was a murder attempt painted with the brush of passive abandonment. They hadn't used a gun or a knife. They had used a forest. They had outsourced their dirty work to nature, to the cold, to starvation, to the random chance of a fall or an animal attack. They could wash their hands of it, tell themselves a story where they just left. The outcome was not their direct responsibility. The thought process that must have gone into it was staggering. The packing of the tents, a quiet, methodical betrayal. Zipping up the bags while we were gone, avoiding eye contact. Folding our sleeping bags, knowing we would never use them again. Carrying the cooler to the car, the one full of the food meant to sustain us. The final act of starting the engines, the low rumble of their escape, while we were on a hill a mile away, pointing out birds to our son. Did they look back? Did Clara hesitate, even for a second? Did Marcus feel a single pang of guilt as he turned the key, erasing a 20-year friendship? The note was the most twisted part. This is for the best. For whose best? For theirs, obviously. A life unencumbered by me, by a messy divorce, by custody battles. A clean slate built on a foundation of mine and my son's bones. And the final, sickening instruction, trust me. It was a final turn of the knife, a mockery of the very foundation of our relationship. Trust was all we had, and she had used it as the final weapon against me. I sank to my knees, the note crumpling in my fist. A wave of pure, unadulterated despair washed over me, so powerful it was physically nauseating. I wanted to scream, to rage, to tear the world apart with my bare hands. But I couldn't, because Leo was there, his small face a mask of confusion and fear. He let go of my hand and put his arm around my shoulder. "It's okay, Daddy," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We'll find them." And in that moment, something inside me shifted. The despair didn't vanish, but it was shoved into a different compartment of my soul, locked behind a heavy iron door. In its place, a cold, hard resolve began to form. Leo's words, his innocent faith in me, were like a splash of icy water. He was right. It had to be okay. I was his father. My only job in that moment, and in every moment that followed, was to keep him alive. The betrayal, the anger, the heartbreak, all of it was a luxury I couldn't afford. It was fuel now. My grief would have to wait. My rage would have to wait. Survival was the only thing that mattered. I looked at my son, this small, brave boy who was looking to me to make sense of the senseless. I took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the air into my lungs. I had to be the rock. I had to be the protector. I had to be the man they thought I wasn't. They had left a husband and a father to die in the woods. They had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had forgotten who I was, who my son was. They had forgotten that we were not victims. We were survivors. And we would get out of this. I stood up, brushing the dirt from my knees. I took the note into my pocket, a cold reminder, a promise to myself. I looked into my son's eyes and forced a smile that I prayed looked more convincing than it felt. "You're right, buddy," I said, my voice hoarse but steady. "It's gonna be okay. It's just a new adventure, a real one." He didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded, a flicker of his trust in me returning to his eyes. And so our ordeal began. Not with a bang, but with the terrifying, deafening silence of a forest that had suddenly become our prison, and a 6-word note that served as its decree. The first few hours were a blur of managed panic. My mind, which had been reeling with shock and grief, was forced into a brutally pragmatic mode. The sun was already high in the sky, which meant we had maybe 7 or 8 hours of daylight left. The first night was coming, and the thought of being out here in the pitch black, with no shelter and no fire, was a terror I couldn't allow myself to dwell on. My priorities slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. Water, shelter, fire. In that order. I remembered that from some half-forgotten survival show I'd watched years ago. It sounded so simple on television. Here, with the weight of my son's life on my shoulders, it felt like an impossible trinity. First, water. We were near the stream, the same one that had provided the gentle, babbling soundtrack to our happy family campsite just the night before. Now, its sound was a lifeline. I led Leo to its edge. The water was clear, running cool over smooth stones, but I knew better than to just drink it. Giardia, bacteria, all sorts of microscopic horrors could be lurking in even the most pristine-looking water. Without a filter or the ability to boil, it was a huge risk. But dehydration was a faster, more certain enemy. We had to drink. I found a spot where the water was running fastest, telling Leo to drink just a little to let his body adjust. I drank too, the cold liquid a shock to my system. It was a gamble, but it was one we had to take. Next, shelter. The temperature in the Ardennes can drop sharply at night, even in late summer. We needed to get out of the wind and off the cold ground. I scanned the area around the clearing. My eyes landed on a large fallen log, thick as a car, with a dense thicket of fir trees behind it. It wasn't a cave, but it was a start. I explained the plan to Leo, trying to frame it as a game. "We're gonna build the coolest fort ever," I said, my voice artificially bright. He was quiet, his earlier fear having subsided into a sort of numb watchfulness, but he nodded and followed my lead. For the next several hours, we worked. I broke off dead branches from the lower parts of trees, dragging them to the log. I showed Leo how to weave smaller, flexible branches between the larger ones, creating a rough, lattice-like wall. We then gathered huge armfuls of dry leaves, pine needles, and moss, stuffing them into the gaps of our makeshift wall to act as insulation. The largest and most important task was creating a bed. I piled up a thick mound of dry leaves and pine needles against the log, at least a foot deep, to insulate us from the cold, damp ground. It was back-breaking work. My hands, accustomed to a keyboard and not much else, were quickly scratched and raw. My muscles, used to a comfortable, sedentary life, screamed in protest. But every time I felt a wave of exhaustion, I would look at Leo. He was working just as hard, his small face set with a grim determination I had never seen before. He wasn't complaining. He wasn't crying. He was gathering handfuls of moss, his movements methodical and focused. He was mirroring my resolve, and in doing so, he was strengthening it. He was no longer just a child I had to protect. He was my partner in this, my teammate. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that felt like a cruel mockery of our situation, our shelter was complete. It was a crude, ugly thing, a lean-to of sticks and leaves, but it was ours. It was a shield. Finally, fire. This was the one I dreaded most. In my pocket, I had a small multitool that Marcus had given me for my last birthday, another bitter pill of irony, and a disposable lighter. I almost wept with relief when I found the lighter. I thought it was in my backpack, which was, of course, gone. It must have been in my pocket from lighting the stove that morning. It was half empty, but it was a chance. I cleared a small area of all debris down to the bare earth and ringed it with stones from the stream bed. I gathered the driest tinder I could find, birch bark shavings, tiny, brittle twigs, the fluffy down from a thistle plant. I built a small teepee structure with kindling, then larger sticks around that. My hands were shaking. If this didn't work, if the lighter failed, the night would be infinitely more terrifying. The cold would be a real danger, and the psychological comfort of a flame, a beacon against the darkness, would be lost. I shielded the tinder with my body, flicked the flint wheel, and a tiny, precious flame bloomed. I held it to the birch bark. It caught, a flicker of orange that grew, licking at the kindling. I blew gently, carefully, feeding it, praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. The kindling caught, then the larger sticks. A proper fire was alive, crackling and spitting, pushing back the encroaching shadows. I sat back on my heels, overcome with a wave of profound, primal relief. We had water, we had shelter, we had fire, we had survived day one. As darkness fell completely, the forest transformed. The familiar, friendly woods of the day became a place of unseen movements and strange noises. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of a distant owl sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I pulled Leo into our lean-to, and we huddled together on our bed of leaves. The fire cast a warm glow, but beyond its small circle of light, the darkness was absolute. The cold began to seep in, a damp, penetrating chill that our small fire couldn't completely ward off. Leo was shivering, and I wrapped my arms around him, trying to share my body heat. It was then, in the suffocating quiet of our first night, that the iron door I'd locked my emotions behind began to buckle. With the immediate tasks of survival handled for the moment, my mind was free to return to the betrayal. The why of it all began to circle me like a predator. Clara. I saw her face in the dancing flames, her smile, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. I replayed our last conversation, her kiss. Have fun, my two brave explorers. Was she laughing inside even then? Was it all a performance? The past 10 years of my life began to unspool in my mind, and every memory was now tainted, poisoned by this new, horrific knowledge. Our wedding day, the birth of our son, family holidays, quiet Sunday mornings. Was any of it real, or was I just a convenient placeholder, a stepping stone in a long, cruel game? And Marcus, my brother, the man I had trusted with my deepest fears and my greatest joys. How could he have stood there, waved at me, and known he was sending me and his godson to our potential deaths? The affair was the obvious answer, the simplest one. It had to be. Clara and Marcus. The thought was so repulsive, so fundamentally wrong, that my stomach churned. The signs, in retrospect, were probably there. The late nights at work for both of them. The shared, private jokes that I was never privy to. The way they sometimes seemed to communicate without words. I had dismissed it all as the easy intimacy of old friends. I had been a fool, a blind, trusting fool. But even an affair didn't explain this level of monstrousness. Why not just leave me? Why not face me and tell me the truth? The answer that kept presenting itself was both cowardly and terrifying. They didn't want the mess. They wanted a clean break. They wanted to start their new life together without the baggage of a bitter ex-husband, a shared custody schedule, alimony payments. They had weighed the value of our lives against their convenience and found us wanting. They had dehumanized us to the point where we were just a problem to be solved, and the forest was their final solution. A quiet rage began to build in me, a slow-burning fire that was hotter and more intense than the one crackling a few feet away. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger I might have expected. It was a cold, deep, glacial rage. It was a promise. I would not let them win. I would not let this forest be my grave. I would walk out of here. I would take my son home. And I would face them. I held Leo tighter. He had fallen into a fitful, exhausted sleep, his breathing shallow. He was so small, so innocent in all of this. He was the real victim. Whatever pain I was feeling was magnified 1,000 times by what had been done to him, by the theft of his mother, his innocence, his sense of security. The love I felt for him in that moment was a fierce, physical thing. It was an anchor in the swirling chaos of my emotions. It was the only thing that was real. The night was endless. I didn't sleep. I fed the fire, stick by stick, listening to the sounds of the night, my mind a battlefield of grief, rage, and a desperate, clinging hope. I thought about the world we had left behind, a world that was, for us, now as distant as the moon. A world where people were presumably sleeping in warm beds, their bellies full, their biggest concern what to watch on Netflix. For them, we had simply vanished. They had orchestrated our disappearance so perfectly, no one would even know we were missing for days. We were supposed to be on a week-long camping trip, off-grid. By the time anyone might start to worry, we would be long gone. It was a perfect crime. But they had underestimated me, and they had underestimated my son. As the first faint gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I felt a subtle shift. The terror of the first night was replaced by a grim sense of purpose. Yesterday was about shock. Today was about work. The hunger was now a dull, persistent ache in my stomach. The granola bar from yesterday was a distant memory. Food was now the top priority. I couldn't risk drinking the stream water indefinitely. We had to find a way to boil it. That meant finding a container. My mind raced, sifting through survival trivia. A can? A bottle? There was nothing. They had been meticulous in clearing the site. Then an idea sparked. Tree bark. I'd seen a video once about making a makeshift container from a large piece of birch bark, folded and pinned with sticks, sturdy enough to hold water. It was a long shot. I had to find the right tree, a large paper birch, and peel the bark without killing it, a detail that seemed absurdly conscientious under the circumstances. I left Leo by the fire, instructing him not to wander, to shout if he saw or heard anything. He just nodded, his eyes large in his smudged face. He was in a state of shock, his usual childish energy completely gone, replaced by a solemn, quiet obedience. Finding the right tree took hours. I walked in expanding circles from our camp, always keeping it in sight, my eyes scanning the forest. Finally, I found it. A beautiful, mature birch with thick, peelable bark. Using the small knife on my multi-tool, I carefully made a long vertical incision and gently, painstakingly, pried off a large, flexible sheet. It felt like a monumental victory. Back at camp, I folded it into a rough box-like shape, using sharpened twigs as pins to hold the corners together. I filled it with water from the stream. It leaked, but slowly. It would have to do. The next challenge was heating the water without burning the bark container. I couldn't put it directly on the fire. The trick, I remembered, was to heat stones in the fire until they were glowing hot, then use sticks to pick them up and drop them into the water. It was a slow, tedious process. I heated stones, dropped them in, sizzle, steam. I repeated it over and over. After almost an hour, the water was bubbling. We had clean, safe drinking water. I felt a surge of triumph that was almost dizzying. It was a small thing, but in this new world, it was everything. We had made water safe. We could do this. We could survive. The next 8 days were a brutal, monotonous, and transformative eternity. Time lost its conventional meaning, measured not in hours and minutes, but in sunrises, sunsets, and the gnawing emptiness in our stomachs. Our lives devolved into a series of stark, primal tasks. Maintain the fire, boil water, find food, reinforce the shelter. Each task was a battle, each small success a stay of execution. The hunger was a living entity, a constant companion. On the third day, it became a sharp, agonizing pain that doubled me over. By the fifth, it had subsided into a dull, hollow ache, a constant, wearying drain on our energy. We became obsessed with food, our eyes scanning every inch of the forest floor, every bush, every tree for something, anything edible. My limited knowledge of wild edibles, gleaned from nature documentaries and childhood scouting trips, was now the most valuable knowledge I possessed. I recognized wild sorrel, its sharp, lemony taste a welcome shock to our palates. We found a patch of late-season blackberries, thorny and difficult to reach, but we painstakingly picked every last one, rationing them like precious jewels. Each berry was an explosion of sweetness in our mouths, a ghost of a world filled with flavor. I spent hours by the stream, trying to fashion a fishing spear from a long, straight sapling, hardening the tip in the fire and carving barbs into it with my knife. I stood for what felt like days, motionless in the cold water, my legs numb, waiting for the flash of a small trout. Failure after failure left me shivering and despondent, but I kept trying, driven by the image of Leo's gaunt face. Finally, on the sixth day, my luck changed. A small fish, maybe 6 inches long, darted into the shallows. My spear thrust was clumsy, but it connected. I let out a hoarse cry of triumph as I pulled it from the water, a wriggling silver prize. That night we cooked it on a flat stone heated in the fire. We shared it, each bite savored, the flaky, smoky meat the most delicious thing I had ever tasted. It wasn't enough to fill us, not even close, but it was a surge of protein, a boost of morale that was worth more than the calories. It was proof that the forest could provide, that we could wrest a living from it. The physical toll was immense. We both lost weight at an alarming rate. My clothes hung on my frame, and I could feel the sharp angles of bones I hadn't been aware of before. Our faces became thin and sallow, our eyes sunken. We were covered in scratches, insect bites and bruises. My hands were a mess of blisters and cuts from chopping wood and gathering branches. Every movement was an effort. But as our bodies weakened, something else was happening. We were adapting. Our senses sharpened. We learned to read the forest, to understand its language. We could tell the direction of the wind by the sway of the tallest pines. We knew the different bird calls, which ones signified a predator nearby, which ones were just idle chatter. We could spot the faintest animal trail in the undergrowth. We moved through the woods with a new quietness, a new awareness. The forest was no longer just a prison. It was a harsh and unforgiving teacher, and we were its reluctant students. The nights were the hardest. Huddled in our lean-to, with only the fire for company, the psychological battle raged. My mind would relentlessly replay the betrayal, examining it from every angle, like a tongue probing a sore tooth. I dissected my entire relationship with Clara. I saw now that her distance wasn't new. It had been a slow, creeping glacier for years, something I had willfully ignored, attributing it to stress, to life, to the natural erosion of passion over time. I remembered moments, a secretive phone call she ended abruptly when I walked into the room, a weekend trip she took with Sophie that Marcus hadn't joined, an expensive piece of jewelry I hadn't bought her that she claimed was a gift from a client. The pieces were all there, scattered in plain sight. I just hadn't wanted to put them together. The affair with Marcus now seemed like an undeniable, screaming truth. Their easy camaraderie, which I'd always seen as a testament to our close-knit group, now looked like a series of brazen, public indiscretions. They had hidden in plain sight, protected by my own trusting nature. I hated my past self for his blindness, for his naive belief in the goodness of the people he loved. But the question that haunted me more than the why was the how. How could a human being, a mother, do this to her own child? I would look at Leo sleeping beside me, his face peaceful in the firelight, and a wave of protective fury would wash over me that was so intense it felt like it could burn the whole forest down. How could she have looked at this face, this perfect, innocent boy, and decided he was disposable, an acceptable casualty in her quest for a new life? This was a level of sociopathic cruelty I couldn't comprehend. It broke something fundamental in my understanding of the world. The line between good and evil had always been blurry for me, a spectrum of gray. But this was not gray. This was black. This was the absolute absence of light. My thoughts about them changed. In the beginning, I had felt grief and a sense of personal failure. Now, all that was burned away, replaced by a cold, hard contempt. They weren't tragic figures or flawed humans. They were pathetic. They were cowards of the highest order, so terrified of confrontation, of consequences, of looking like the bad guys in a divorce, that they had opted for a plan that was both ludicrously theatrical and monstrously evil. They hadn't been strong enough to end our relationship face to face, so they had tried to have nature do it for them. They had seen me as weak, as an obstacle that would simply crumble and disappear. That was their greatest mistake. Leo was changing too. The shock and fear of the first few days had been replaced by a quiet, stoic resilience that was heartbreakingly adult. He rarely spoke unless necessary. He worked tirelessly, gathering firewood, checking my makeshift snares for small game. They were always empty, but he never stopped checking, helping me haul water. He had lost the carefree buoyancy of childhood. He had seen the true face of the world far too young. But he hadn't broken. In fact, he was becoming incredibly strong. He learned to tie knots, to build a fire, to be patient and silent. We developed our own nonverbal communication, a language of nods and glances. We were a unit, a two-person tribe forged in the crucible of this wilderness. Our bond, which had always been strong, was now something else entirely. It was elemental. We were two parts of a single organism, surviving together. I knew that if we made it out, this experience would scar him forever. But I also saw that it was forging something in him, a core of strength and self-reliance that most people never find in a lifetime. On the 8th day, it rained. A cold, relentless downpour that started in the afternoon and continued through the night. Our shelter, which had seemed so robust in the dry weather, began to leak. Drips of cold water found their way through our roof of leaves and branches, soaking our clothes and our bedding. The fire hissed and sputtered, and I had to build a small wall of wet logs and bark around it to protect it from the worst of the rain. We huddled together, shivering, miserable, and soaked to the bone. The cold was a physical pain, seeping into our joints, making our teeth chatter uncontrollably. It was the lowest point we had reached. Despair, which I had fought so hard to keep at bay, began to creep back in. I felt my resolve wavering. We were so weak, so cold. It would be so easy to just stop, to let the fire go out, to close my eyes and let the cold take us. We huddled together, shivering, miserable, and soaked to the bone. The cold was a physical pain, seeping into our joints, making our teeth chatter uncontrollably. It was the lowest point we had reached. Despair, which I had fought so hard to keep at bay, began to creep back in. I felt my resolve wavering. We were so weak, so cold. It would be so easy to just stop, to let the fire go out, to close my eyes and let the cold take us. The thought was seductive in its finality. Just as I felt myself slipping into that dark place, I felt a small hand on my arm. It was Leo. He was looking at me, his eyes clear and steady in the dim, flickering light. He wasn't crying. He wasn't complaining. He just looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. "Are you giving up?" In that look, I saw an incredible strength, a mirror of the resolve I had been trying to show him. He was not giving up. And if this 8-year-old boy, who had been abandoned by his mother and was now cold, starving, and miserable, could find the strength to keep going, then who was I to falter? His silent courage was a rebuke and an inspiration. I pulled him into a fierce hug, my own weakness shaming me. "No," I whispered, as much to myself as to him. "We're not giving up. Never." I spent the rest of the night tending the fire, feeding at every scrap of dry wood I had saved, fighting off the cold and my own demons. As the rain finally stopped and the first light of the 9th day broke, weak and gray, I knew we had passed a test. The forest had thrown its worst at us, and we had endured. We were still alive. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that we were going to get out. The thought of what waited for us on the other side was no longer a source of pain. It was a destination. It was a reckoning. They had tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds. The 10th day dawned clear and cool. The rain had washed the air, and the forest seemed brighter, greener, as if it had been reborn. A sense of finality hung in the air. We were weaker than we had ever been, our bodies running on nothing but fumes and sheer will, but my mind was sharper and more focused than ever before. I knew we couldn't stay in the clearing. Our meager food sources were depleted, and waiting for a rescue that would never come was a fool's hope. They hadn't reported us missing. They were counting on us never being found. We had to move. We had to walk out. But which way? I had a decent sense of direction, but in this dense, rolling landscape, it was easy to get turned around, to walk in circles. I needed a landmark, a sign. I decided to climb. Not far from our camp was a steep, rocky hill, the one that Eagles Point was on, but I needed to go higher. I left Leo with a small pile of firewood and the task of keeping the fire going, a responsibility he accepted with his usual quiet gravity. The climb was brutal. My legs were trembling with weakness and my lungs burned. I had to pull myself up by roots and rocks, my raw hands screaming with every grip. But as I gained height, the trees began to thin. Finally, I broke through the canopy and scrambled onto a rocky ledge near the summit. And I saw it. It was far away, a faint gray ribbon cutting through the endless sea of green. A road. It was miles away, at least a day's hard walk, maybe more in our weakened state. But it was there. It was real. It was a path back to the world. Below me, I could just make out the faint plume of smoke from our campfire, a tiny, fragile signal of our existence in this vast wilderness. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a rush of hope so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. We had a direction. We had a goal. I scrambled back down the hill, my movements reckless with renewed purpose. I explained the plan to Leo. We would pack nothing. We had nothing to pack. We would take a drink of boiled water, and then we would walk. We would walk until we hit that road or until we collapsed. There were no other options. And so we started. We left our small, crude camp behind without a backward glance. It had been our sanctuary and our prison for 10 days, but its purpose was served. We walked. It was a slow, agonizing march. Every step was an effort. We moved in silence, conserving our energy. I kept our direction fixed on a distant peak I had seen from the hilltop, which I knew was in the direction of the road. Hours passed. The sun beat down on us. My head was light with hunger and exhaustion. Leo was stumbling, his face a pale, determined mask. I held his hand, half supporting him, half drawing strength from his resilience. We stopped for a short rest in the late afternoon. As we sat on a log, a sound drifted through the trees. It was faint, but unmistakable. A low, mechanical hum. The sound of an engine. We both froze, looking at each other. It grew louder, closer. It was the sound of a logging truck, its engine straining as it navigated a dirt track. It wasn't the paved road I had seen, but it was something better. It was here. It was now. I pulled Leo to his feet and we began to run, or at least a stumbling, shambling version of it. We crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at our faces, shouting with what little breath we had left. "Hey, over here! Help!" The truck came into view, a huge mud-splattered beast. The driver, a large man with a thick beard, saw us. His eyes went wide with shock and he slammed on the brakes. He jumped out of the cab, his face a mixture of fear and disbelief. He was looking at two ghosts, two wild, emaciated creatures that had emerged from the woods, our clothes in tatters, our faces and arms covered in a latticework of scratches and grime. "My God," he whispered as he ran towards us. "What happened to you?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. The rush of adrenaline that had propelled us forward vanished, and the full weight of the last 10 days came crashing down on me. My legs gave out, and I collapsed. The last thing I remember is the logger catching me and Leo's small, terrified face looking down at me before the world went black. Waking up was a slow, confusing process. The first thing I registered was a soft, clean surface beneath me, a mattress. The second was the smell, antiseptic and clean linen. I was in a hospital. My eyes fluttered open. The light was dim. Leo was asleep in a chair beside my bed, a blanket tucked around him. He looked small and fragile, but he was clean and his breathing was deep and even. A nurse came in, her expression soft and kind. She explained that we had been brought to the nearest regional hospital. We were suffering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, and exposure, but we would be fine. We had been lucky, incredibly lucky. The logger who found us had saved our lives. The next few hours were a blur of doctors, nurses, and eventually the police. 2 officers, a man and a woman, came to take my statement. I told them everything. I told them about the camping trip, the walk, the empty clearing, the note. I watched their faces shift from professional sympathy to stunned disbelief. I gave them Clara's full name, Marcus's, Sophie's. I gave them our home address. The female officer made a call. I watched her as she spoke, her voice low. Her eyebrows shot up. She hung up and looked at me, her expression grim. "Mr. Dubois," she said, her voice careful, "there has been no missing persons report filed for you or your son." Of course there hadn't. A cold, bitter satisfaction settled in my chest. This was it. This was the proof, the final nail in their coffin. They hadn't just left us, they had erased us. They had gone back to their lives, our lives, and pretended we had never existed. The police assured me they would handle it. They would be paying a visit to my home. They asked me not to go there, to stay at the hospital until social services could arrange something. I refused. I was polite but firm. I was not a victim in need of protection. I was checking myself and my son out. I was going home, my home. The hospital provided us with some clean clothes from a donation bin. We ate a proper meal, the first in what felt like a lifetime. Then a taxi, paid for by a police voucher, took us on the 2-hour journey home. As we drove, I saw the world with new eyes. The cars, the houses, the people rushing about their lives. It all seemed strange, distant, like a film I was watching. The only thing that felt real was Leo, sitting beside me, his hand firmly in mine. When we pulled up to our house, it was late afternoon. The familiar suburban street looked alien. Marcus's SUV was parked in our driveway next to Clara's car. They were here. They were together. My heart was a cold, steady drum in my chest. I paid the driver and we got out. I put my old key in the lock. It turned. I pushed the door open and we walked in. They were in the living room, Clara and Marcus. They were on the sofa, sharing a bottle of wine, watching television. They looked comfortable, relaxed, at home. The scene was so grotesquely domestic it took my breath away. They heard the door and turned. Their faces. I will never, for as long as I live, forget the looks on their faces. Clara's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor, a splash of red like blood. Her face went slack, her skin turning a chalky fish belly white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Marcus shot to his feet, knocking over the coffee table. His eyes were wide, bulging with a terror that was primal. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost, seeing 2 ghosts. They were staring at us as if we had clawed our way out of the grave, and in a way we had. I said nothing. I just stood there in the doorway, my son at my side. I didn't have to say a word. Our presence was the only accusation necessary. We were their failed murder, their living, breathing conscience. We were skeletal, scarred, and filthy, but we were alive. We were strong. The forest hadn't broken us. It had stripped us down to our essential selves and then forged us anew in fire and hunger. In my silence, in my cold, steady gaze, they saw not the weak, trusting man they had left to die, but the man who had survived their worst. They saw the man who had carried his son through hell and back. They saw the man who now held all the power. Their comfortable new life, built on our presumed deaths, was over. It had just shattered, along with the wine glass on the floor. They had thought the story was over, with them as the victors. They were wrong. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of their reckoning, and we were the judges. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to Reddit Whispers, where the real stories get told.